Good evening, New Orleans, and welcome to Inside New Orleans Sports. Over the next hour, we're going to look back at 50 years of the New Orleans Saints, and we got two great guests that are going to break it down for you. Ro Brown, sports director, WBOK Radio, also part of SportsNola.com, and Kenny Trahan of SportsNola.com, WGSO Radio, WHNO-TV, and, by the way, also handles the Saints Hall of Fame Museum. We'll talk about the last 50 years, and maybe some great memories for you as we go forward. Guys, welcome to the show. As always, thanks so much for being here. And I always like to start off letting folks know a little bit about what you're involved in. Mr. Brown, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And please let the audience know a little bit about what Ro Brown is involved in.
My real job, I work at the University of New Orleans. I work in the athletics department there. In addition to, as you said, I do a little stuff at WBOK, WGSO with him, SportsNola.com with him. And since he does everything and runs everything and owns everything, everything I do is with him. You know, I mean, I'm on the Saints Hall of Fame Selection Committee.
With him.
Yeah.
Who has his hands in everything.
Everything. He's everywhere.
No doubt about it. Kenny, welcome
Yeah,
back.
he's looking at me.
We've known each other much too long.
There's no doubt. Welcome back to the show, and if you would, kind of pick up where Ro left off. Tell us a little bit about what you're involved in.
Well, you just mentioned the preponderance of it with the Saints Hall of Fame and being the general manager and chairman of the board since its inception in 1988. Running SportsNola.com, which has truly been a blessing to have some great people involved. We need to get you involved. Also, being involved with running WGSO and doing sports talk there for 15 years and games and overseeing the department. I've gone through every renaissance there imaginable, including running the station. Thank goodness I don't do that anymore. And beyond that, running Life Resources Ministries, doing television shows elsewhere, and I don't know. I could go on and on, but we don't have the time, so let that suffice.
Well, thanks for being with us tonight. It ought to be a really great night looking back on 50 years of the New Orleans Saints. We start in the 1960s, and guys, November 1st, 1966, the franchise was awarded to New Orleans, but it started a lot earlier, didn't it? It started with Hale Boggs and the congressional delegation doing a little arm twisting on Pete Rozelle. If you would, kind of take us back to before the franchise was awarded to New Orleans.
You know, I think I was like a lot of people in this regard. It started even earlier for me. The Saints did. You know, the Saints for me started in 1960, the first pro football game I ever saw. An exhibition game at Tad Gormley Stadium between the Packers, who were wearing blue and white, it was that long ago, and the Pittsburgh Steelers. That was the first professional football
exhibition game?
Yeah, exhibition game at Tad Gormley Stadium. And I always, I was, 8, 9 years old, and why can't we have a pro football team here? Why can't we have a Major League Baseball team here, And so that was the first time I saw a professional athletic event. And then the subsequent exhibition games after that, the doubleheader in 1963 at Tulane Stadium, Colts and Cardinals in 65, 66, and just all those. To me, that's where the Saints kind of started because I knew that they were trying to get a pro football team, and I really wanted us to have one. Right. So, that's where it really started for me. Even before November 1st, 1966 with, thank God for Hale Boggs and Russell Long and arm twisting, because Atlanta got a team before us, and we had the running thing where they'd have exhibition games. They'd draw 40, we'd draw 80, and they got a team before us. So enter Hale Boggs and Russell Long.
Right. If you would, pick up Russell Boggs and Russell Long and Hale Boggs, but before that, your first memories of pro football here in New Orleans?
Now, very much like Ro. I went to 2 exhibition games in the early 60s, and you guys are right. Russell Long probably is the one that really pushed it across the finish line. He did the lion's share of the work to make this happen. Hale Boggs was significant as well, and of course, Dave Dixon played the largest role from the standpoint of being the biggest supporter of and proponent of football. Dave had the dream of being able to get a franchise here. He went after the AFL very hard. Of course, the All-Star game fiasco that occurred here that had some real issues because of racism and issues that existed in the Old South, and that had to change. And I think that's one of the reasons we were behind Atlanta and Miami in the pecking order, frankly. But once the politicians got involved, and Pete Rozelle was a young man, let's not forget that. And I think he was able to be influenced at that particular point in his existence. It would be much, much more difficult for a city like New Orleans, the market size that it is, to get a franchise now as compared to then. But same memories. I went to a couple of those exhibition games. I thought they were fantastic. I always wanted Major League Baseball here. I still think it would be a better fit overall than basketball because it's a tourism sport and it happens during the summer and it's a more affordable ticket. But that's me.
Right.
You know, in 1960, I knew exactly where I sat because I sat where I was told to sit at that game.
Yes.
Okay, it was at the end of that horseshoe. Okay, and at the time, you know, you're not thinking about that. I mean, I knew that, but man, I got to see Bart Starr and Jim Taylor and Paul Hornung, you know, and Bobby Lane and these kind of people. And then with the 1965 AFL All-Star game, you know, situation where the game was moved to Houston because
we elaborate on that for fans that don't know what happened.
In 1965, the AFL, the American Football League's All-Star game, was going to be held here in New Orleans. New Orleans was trying to get a pro team, NFL trying to get something. And so the game was held here in New Orleans. The week before the game, many of the African-American players had trouble getting cabs to pick them up, and they weren't allowed to go into nightclubs, and especially in the French Quarter.
Hotels.
So they decided, we're not playing. And I think Joe Foss was the commissioner of the AFL then, and they moved the game. And there was a kind of a black eye for New Orleans. I mean, it still recovered from it. But Dave Dixon, who I loved, who was a good friend of mine, I'm glad you mentioned Dave. As far as I'm concerned, the only reason why Dave Dixon wasn't the New Orleanian of the 20th century is because Louis Armstrong was. Okay, and you know, to me, I mean, that's how I've always felt about it. I mean, he was probably the single most important New Orleanian after Louis Armstrong.
And if you would, for the audience, why? Kind of name the things he was involved with, that maybe some people don't know.
You know, New Orleans needs a professional football team. So he went about and set about doing it.
Right.
New Orleans needs a dome stadium. That would be a good idea. His idea, he did it. You know, football in the spring would do well.
That's right.
The United States Football League. You know, tennis balls shouldn't always be white. World Championship tennis. Okay, the handsome eight. He was a guy with ideas. Okay, which a lot of people say sometimes we in New Orleans don't think forward. Dave Dixon was always thinking in a forward manner.
Yes.
And you know, it's impossible. You know, I just always hope that the Saints never really totally divorced themselves from the memory of Dave Dixon, because there's no Saints without Dave Dixon.
He's kind of the
godfather
godfather
doesn't exist.
of pro football,
you know,
right?
Yeah, exactly. It does not exist. He was that important.
The antitrust legislation, which we know was part of the New Orleans getting a franchise, Kenny, that was really the big part of this. The NFL wanted to make sure that they were involved and didn't get involved in any. They wanted antitrust. The city obviously wanted a franchise, and at that time, a very, very strong congressional contingent was able to put that together.
Yeah, very much so. And I think we've detailed the people that were the key people to help make that happen. But from the standpoint of what ended up happening here was, and we'll get into the football, but it was an instant love affair. Initially, there's a contest to name the team. Once the franchise was awarded, of course, John Meekum Sr. gave his son the money. He's 27 years old. And everybody thought you were getting a young whippersnapper and handsome guy, the whole deal. And God bless him, he was a nice enough man, but a terrible owner. And that said, the contest comes along, and people got involved on an incredible basis. And all of this is detailed in the Saints Hall of Fame. You can go check it out and enjoy it. But to see the passion of the people, and then, of course, they arrive at the name. And once they get the name, then you've got an outcry from religious people in town and people of faith, and I'm one of those, so I get it completely, about you're going to play on Sunday and you're going to call this team the Saints? Are you serious? How blasphemous can you be? So it took an invitation and then a prayer from Archbishop Philip Hannon, a wonderful man, who about 2 months before he perished was in the Saints Hall of Fame in the Dome. He wanted to see things one last time. What a wonderful guy. And he, of course, devised the prayer and basically gave it a blessing and said, it's okay. to play football on a Sunday, and the name's fine and everything else, but yet to this day, many people felt that was why the team failed and had a lack of success, is that it was divine intervention.
Kenny mentioned Russell Long and the arm twisting. It made me think about when you mentioned him. President Jimmy Carter said that all his life he lived for the day, or dreamed of the day that a Southerner would be running the country. He said, then I got elected president. I got to Washington and found out a Southerner had been running the country all along. Russell Long.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Do you guys remember any of the other nicknames who were out there during that time?
Yeah.
Can you give some of those to the audience, if you would?
Sure, you had Jazz Kings, you had Gators, you had Nightlife, you had a lot of different. It's kind of interesting too, because we ended up having a basketball team called the Jazz.
Yes.
We ended up having a football team called the Knight.
Yes.
So it's pretty interesting when you go back and look at some of the names that were suggested at the time. These names are kicked around even now.
Right.
We're talking about a baseball team in the Zephyrs that are going to be renamed next year. We just went through the whole Pelicans rename and rebrand a couple of years ago. So it's funny because a lot of the same names were talked about then. Tarpons was another one that was mentioned at the time. So all indigenous to the culture, which made sense. But ultimately the concept of the Saints was really all about the song. It was all about when the Saints go marching in.
But Kenny, I never thought it was going to be anything else. Because I can remember there was like a form in the newspaper about buying tickets. Okay, this was before you had a team.
Right.
And they called the team the Saints.
Well, that was Dave Dixon.
Exactly.
Dave Dixon had a ticket
else.
form to sell to one of his exhibition games.
Yeah.
And the whole pitch to it was, you need to buy tickets so that ultimately we can land an AFL franchise, the New Orleans Saints.
Wow.
Yep. Yeah, I can
He envisioned that years
yeah.
before it happened. So, again, you talk about a visionary, a special man. Tulane misses him, too. He loved Tulane very much.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Tulane, talk about Tulane Stadium. Obviously, at that point, I think the largest steel stadium in the world.
Largest steel structured stadium in the world.
And talk about that venue for games, and some of the your early memories of Tulane Stadium, and Tulane Stadium hosting the Saints as well.
Yeah, my first game there was a Tulane game. It was 1960 also.
Okay.
It was Ole Miss and Tulane. Ole Miss was #1 in the nation that week. Tommy Mason was at Tulane, Terry Tarabon, Phil Nugent, all those guys. Jake Gibbs was at Ole Miss. And that's the first time I went into this huge stadium, that my father used to tell me about, and that I saw from outside, but it was the first time I went in. Subsequently, I went a number of years, but there was just something special about that hot September 17th, 1967 day of that first game.
Yes.
Okay. It's still the loudest crowd I've ever heard.
Even more loud than the Dome coming?
Yeah, because my ears rang. I mean, it didn't, but it really was. It was the loudest crowd I think I've ever heard, even under the roof of the Dome. I mean, that was really loud when John Gilliam returned that kickoff 94 yards.
Which it was magical, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's the kind of thing where, my whole family was there, my mom, my sister, my brother, everybody, $1 if you were under 16 to sit in the end zone.
I was going to ask you, do you remember how the cost of the ticket?
$1 if you were under 16 to sit in the end zone. And, to see the Rams, and just, it's what I dreamed about 7 years earlier.
Yeah.
Where we actually have a professional sports franchise here.
Right. Kenny, why don't you talk about Tulane Stadium and then your first memories of Tulane Stadium and then with the Saints, when the Saints obviously made that their home.
I was a Cub Scout and a Boy Scout, and I went to games then, and my recollection would be Georgia Tech, Notre Dame in particular. Those games stood out. We rode a bus from school as a scout to the game, and we learned for the first time, hooray for the bus driver, bus driver, bus driver, hooray for the bus driver. So it was all good. We get to the stadium, it was gigantic, obviously, and really was mesmerized by the entire experience. Ultimately, of course, the Saints are born, the September 17th game. I'm there in the south end zone. I'm 11 years old, sitting with my father. And the thing that sticks out to me the most, the Gilliam run went the other way, so they went in the other direction. And just thought it was going to be easy at that point, first play, and you score a touchdown. But that said, the guy sitting in front of me, 3 seats down, I remember it specifically the whole time. And he was some loudmouth white guy. The whole game, from the very start of the game, from the first series, he kept screaming, "We want Collazo. We want Collazo." So I finally nudged my dad. I said, "Dad, what's Collazo?" He says, "Oh, he means Quazzo, backup quarterback." Everybody wants the backup quarterback. Right. Remarkable. But my sister was an original dancer for the Saints Mademoiselles in '67. She ultimately danced for the Saints Bonamies and the Saints Angels. My wife danced for the Saints. My sister introduced me to my wife. I ended up working Saints games, of course, covering them. I sold Brown's Velvet Ice Cream when I was a teenager at Tulane Stadium. Started covering the Saints when I was 20 and ended up doing their broadcast and ended up running the Saints Hall of Fame. Dad's an original season ticket holder. We still have those tickets, so you get the picture.
Yeah.
Very deep ties.
My sister performed at the first halftime show.
Really?
As a member of the Xavier University Choir.
Amazing.
Singing Up, Up, and Away.
Yeah.
Well, the halftime shows
With
were
Al
the best
Hurt.
thing about the games.
Right.
'Cause
Talk
Wayne-
about the halftime shows.
Yeah, yeah.
It
Wayne
really
Walker
was.
produced the halftime
Tommy-
shows.
Tommy Walker.
Tommy Walker. They did the. Well, he mentioned Up, Up, and Away. Fifth Dimension performed at halftime. Carol Channing performed. I mean, they brought in all kinds of people.
Right.
And of course, the what they staged. And that was a big part of it. I mean, they had guys skyrocketing into the stadiums,
Yes.
hot air balloons.
Battle in New
But then the
Orleans.
Battle in New Orleans, but the problem about that was my sister was standing about 10 feet away when the cannon went off, and unfortunately she saw the whole thing and the guy lost his hand. And she's standing 10 feet away and saw the whole thing.
Was that the end of the cannon, guys?
Well, that was the end of Tommy Walker's halftime shows by and large. After that,
Right.
they got a mandate. You got to scale this down. You
Right.
can't have this anymore. And of course, the NFL halftime shows pretty much a choreographed now, and it's a shame.
Yeah.
'Cause there's only 12 minutes at halftime.
My second year at Saints Press Guide, you got it there in the
Yeah, we have them
museum.
all, yeah.
My sister, you can see her standing behind Al Hurt. That's the cover of the cover of the Press Guide the next year. So yeah, it's all kinds of really, really great memories of that first year of Saints.
Al Hurt, Pete Fountain. I mean, I can remember so many New Orleans musicians that were there at halftime. I mean, Al Hurt leading the team out. Can you guys talk about those memories?
But here's another New Orleans, totally New Orleans thing. I can remember that first game, Rams Saints, never happened now. People passing food around that they brought into the stadium. Sandwiches and ribs and, people that you didn't know, would you like to, people passing food around.
No, you mentioned the musicians. Of course, Al Hurt was a de facto employee of the team, and a lot of people don't recognize this or realize this to this day in age. But you know who the Saints' initial press box announcer was, don't you? Buddy Diliberto.
Really?
It was Buddy.
Yeah, Buddy was the Saints' biggest booster for the first 3 or 4 years of the franchise. He was a fan, and it turned one day, and it never went back. And his relationship with John Meekum was terribly unfortunate, and unfortunately, it never really healed up. And the owner had a lot to do with that.
Yes. Early Saints teams. Talk about those teams. Talk about some of the players that you remember on those teams. I remember characters and players that were kind of on their last hurrah. Those guys that were just, they came. They were drafted by the Saints, and a lot of those guys that were part of that draft were guys that just were at the end of their careers. When you start talking about the expansion draft.
Yeah, expansion draft. I remember going to a tryout. It was at Tulane's baseball stadium. It wasn't even in the stadium. It was at Tulane's baseball stadium. It was just guys who wanted a shot at playing pro football. I'm sure that, I don't think any of those guys made the team or anything like that. But yeah, the first year, the expansion draft, you had people that you knew from other teams, names that you knew, and then you had some more draft choices because during those days, you were able to draft about 80 people.
Right.
Especially if you were an expansion team, you got an extra draft, almost an extra pick in every round. You mentioned Gary Quazzo, who
Was supposed to be their quarterback.
It was supposed to be their quarterback, but when you think about it, Kenny, I mean, that really told the story of the early years because they gave up so much to get him.
Of course.
To get this veteran quarterback. Right. John Meekum wanted to win now. He thought that getting Horning and Taylor would do that. Okay, so you gave up even more.
Did Paul Horning ever play for the Saints?
No.
Nope.
He didn't.
Nope, he was on
But
the
Jim
sideline.
Taylor did, right?
Jim Taylor played his first year, and he played admirably. They had a terrible offensive line, and he got shellacked. But he played hard and played well, and he got beat up so much he retired after that first year. So actually worked the Saints broadcast for a few years and worked for the team in an executive capacity for a little bit.
But expansion draft successes Doug Atkins and Davey Witzel.
Well, Dave Witzel became the first Pro Bowl player of the Saints, All-Pro, in fact, 10 interceptions his first
Led
year.
the league.
Played wonderfully, and Doug Atkins was really good here.
Yeah.
I mean, people don't understand. He only played here 3 years. He's in the Saints Hall of Fame. Now, it's a place and time. Keep in mind
Right.
that when he was inducted, it was all about the early years of the Hall of Fame. But those 3 years, he was still really good.
He was in his late
a dominant
30s.
player.
Yeah.
Guy just threw people around like rag dolls. He was an exception to the rule at that point in time with his size. Not just big in terms of height, but he was 285 and he was quick.
Long arms and big
Extremely
arms.
long arms and big hands.
Yeah.
And a scary guy.
Yeah. Back then, when you looked at the draft, like you mentioned, 18 rounds, something like that.
17.
17, was it 7th? And in the 17th round, they took a wide receiver out of Xavier, Ohio.
Yeah.
Danny Abramowitz. Huh?
Abramowitz.
Talk about that.
I can remember he made the team solely because of special teams in the exhibition games. You know, he made every tackle, it seemed, in the exhibition games. And that's probably what kept him on the team, I would think. And lo and behold, he becomes this very slow, very good wide receiver. You know, I mean, he was really, really slow, but caught everything, you know, and was tough. Favorite people on there, I remember my sister's favorite player was Obert Logan.
Little O.
Zero?
Little O.
Right.
Was his number.
Right.
You know, Obert Logan. You know, you had people on that team who, you know, probably had no more business playing the National Football League than, you know, like you do on a lot of expansion teams, especially during that time. But, you know, it was fun. They were ours.
Yes.
They belonged to us, you know, whenever they were. They belonged to us.
Right.
They
And
were
the
our
city
guys.
supported him, right?
City supported him. Danny Abramowitz tells a story that he was actually cut.
Yes.
And he talked his way
Back
into
in.
staying on the team at that particular point in time. Good thing. The characters, yeah, they were everywhere. Of course, everybody knows about Atkins and his shenanigans and charades off the field and even on flights. But aside from him, the guy that stood out in my mind, and I still, in running the Hall of Fame, I still deal with a lot of these guys who are still alive, which is great. Bill Cody, wild Bill Cody. He was wild.
Auburn.
I mean, he threw himself all over the place and basically made the team because of his eccentricity on special teams, the way he just was crazed out there, which you had to be, and was really good. Eli Strand's another guy that was a very emotional guy who was just loved the fact that somebody gave him a chance to play in the NFL, and he expressed it all the time. But there were some good players. Yeah, Stonebreaker was a character, and you know, that's how the touchdown club ended up getting formed. Stonebreaker gets in a fight in New York. He gets fined, and Joe Gimelli wants to raise the money to pay the fine, and the league won't do it.
Right.
So they formed the touchdown club instead, and they funnel the money to him anyway. So and that's how the touchdown club ended up getting formed. So those were special times, and there were some good players.
Yeah.
They had a really good young defensive line core there with Dave Rowe and Mike Tillman in particular. Brian Schwader was a solid player. And so they had some pretty good players, but not enough of them. And they did such a poor job drafting that there was no way they could overcome the age, which Rose spoke of, that they started the franchise with, and the lack of hitting on draft picks for several years. Or when they did hit on somebody, they didn't keep them, like John Gilliam, like Ken Burrow, to name a few. So listen, again, the evaluation was awful. I still maintain Tom Fears was a good coach and a good man, but unfortunately,
The first
he was
coach,
saddled.
right?
He was saddled with a horrendous general manager, horrible owner, terrible decisions, and he had to go make something out of it, which of course he couldn't.
Vic Schwenk,
Yeah, Vic Schwenk.
Big Schwenk.
right?
Dick Gordon.
Dick Gordon, the
Gordon,
astronaut.
the astronaut.
Right?
Yeah, but as the history progressed, it got even. It was even
got even
more
more
comical.
bizarre. More
You would think that by the time you get of age, you'd figure it out if you're John Meekum, but instead, you know, you fast forward to 1979. They have one of the two best offenses in the NFL, along with San Diego, and they go 8-8, and they're one of the most exciting teams you could ever imagine. So instead of leaving it alone, they go out and hire Harold Guyver and Dick Rosenblum's son, Steve Rosenblum, to come in here. And Dick Nolan, who is a really good man, says, what are they doing? They came in, they wrecked everything, wouldn't pay guys. Galbraith held out. Muncie had serious off-the-field issues. Don Reese was a problem. The team fell apart. They went 1-15. And that was, to me, that was the beginning of the end for John Meekum. And the end came, of course, on Black Sunday when Bum Phillips elects not to try a 49-yard field goal and decides to punt with Guido Merkins instead of trying a field goal with Morton Anderson. and they punt the ball, and the Rams haven't done anything the whole game, and they get a drive, they go and kick the field goal, and
Mike Lansford,
and that's it. And that was the end of John Meekham's era.
Yeah.
He quit after that, and by the way, Bum Phillips pretty much quit after that too.
Yeah, no doubt. Let's go back a bit, because let's start at the 70s. And in the 70s, you got to think of, I guess the first one, Archie Manning, the drafting of Archie Manning out of Ole Miss.
1971, third pick in the draft.
Third pick, poor guy.
Right.
Yeah, poor guy.
Third pick in the draft. I went in the Navy in 1971. Okay, but was here for the draft. I'll always remember also, my father when talking about their picks. And Tommy Casanova came out the year he came out of LSU. And I can remember Wayne Mack or someone interviewed, general manager or whatever, and said, "What did you think about Tommy Casanova?" And he said, "Well, we had him rated as the 5th best defensive back in the draft."
Close.
And I remember my dad looked at me and said, "There's no hope for these people." That boy is the 5th best defensive back in the draft. He said, "I don't think so." Okay, and Archie comes along. It's a no-brainer. Everybody's glad they got Archie. Archie's a Saint. Remember that was the bumper sticker. And terrific college quarterback. They figured the proximity. He was from Mississippi, played at Ole Miss. Always thinking that they had to have the regional thing, but we were still at a point where this was treated like a college team. Okay, people were gonna, I don't think people started to kind of look at him kind of under-eyed until, maybe around Hank Stram time. I think before that,
right,
just play hard and we're behind you. I think that was the general feeling.
Yes.
But, when you talk about picks, I want to go back also to Les Kelly.
Yeah.
The very first pick out of the University of Alabama, very first number 1 pick.
Right.
That was one where even, at my age, I knew, why did they draft him?
Was he a linebacker and they moved into fullback, or fullback and they moved to linebacker?
At Alabama in the Sugar Bowl against Nebraska, he was a fullback.
Okay.
He played behind Kenny Stabler, and he was just a straight-ahead fullback. The Saints drafted him and they made him a linebacker.
Yeah. So that's always a challenge when you draft someone and then you move them to another position.
Yeah, they said he was a linebacker.
Yes.
Which he wasn't.
Right.
Probably wasn't a fullback either.
Right. Kenny, before there was Archie Manning, there was a 63-yard field goal that happened at Tulane Stadium with Tom Dempsey. Was it November 8th, 1970?
Correct. Yeah, November 8th, 1970, and ironically, the week after Tom Fears got fired. And J.D. Roberts came in from the Richmond Roadrunners, and when you saw what happened in the first game, you thought, boy, what a genius move these guys must have made. But then you hear the stories afterwards. Archie tells some really funny stories.
Yeah,
and God bless J.D. Roberts, but Jay didn't even know the players' names. I could go on and on. It was just comically bad. That said, that was a memory of a lifetime. And Tom, a wonderful man, and our prayers are with him today. Tom can't be, out in public or do anything. He's been pretty much institutionalized, from the things that he's had in his life, and he's a phenomenal human being. And Carlene's a wonderful lady, and we became great friends. And what Tom did that day is, of course, legendary. And the test of time tells you everything you need to know. The record stood for over 4 decades. It's remarkable, and it took altitude to beat it. So Tom is a great guy. I want to say was. He's a great person. Decided to make his home here despite the fact that they kicked him to the curb, and that was another story in itself after the field goal. And after that season, the next year, Roberts wants him to run gassers, and he wants him to do drills with the regular players. And Tom says, "I'm a kicker. I'm not doing that stuff." And the end result was a dispute, and they ended up cutting him. The only problem with that was they'd already published the media guide for that season. And who's on the media guide?
Tom Dempsey.
They cut him. So
Unreal.
Nothing can really speak to the Saints' futility and ignorance at that time more than that.
Yeah.
So, Tom was banished, and it was a shame. All he did was go on and kick 11 years in a league with great success. Sean Payton tells a story that as a kid, Tom came over to him and handed him a ball when he was 11 years old. He said he never forgot that. So when he first got to town, Payton comes to me at the Hall of Fame. We had a private lunch for the coaches, and he says, "I want to meet Tom Dempsey. Do you have contact with him of all your alumni?" I said, "Yes, I do." So I arranged a meeting. They became fast friends. And when Tom ran into his difficulty, Sean insisted on going to visit him. I said, "Well, he's not going to know who you are." but he insisted on doing so anyway. So, one thing about Peyton, you can say anything about him personally or professionally, but he has an incredible sense of the history of the game, and he deeply, deeply appreciates the guys that played the game 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and the way he treats the former players is remarkably good. And I don't, the statute of limitations has run out, so I can say this now. You guys would recall this. I know you would, and you probably would too, Eric. There was a period of time when Tom Benson had bought the team. After a certain period of years, the media guide no longer included anything prior to 1985 and the Tom Benson era. When Sean first got here, and we had this private meeting at the museum with his coaches, and they were amazed. They couldn't believe, man, we got a Hall of Fame for this franchise? Are you kidding me? So, and that's really the way they expressed it.
Yeah.
But Sean says, I want to know what the issues are, because I've heard we don't have a great relationship with our alumni. I said, that would be the understatement of the century. He says, well, what's the problem? I said, well, where do you want to start? They haven't reached out to them. They've done little or nothing for them. The Hall of Fame is really the only ones that do anything for them. And I don't care what people think. That was the truth at the time. Right. Saints have since stepped up and done better things, and that's great. But I told Peyton, I said, let me show you why these guys have a great distaste for the Saints. I went and grabbed a media guy, and I showed it to him. I said, what's wrong with this picture? He looks at it, he says,
67 to 85.
What are they missing, 20 years? Yeah. I said, yeah. He says, well, why is that? I said, it's by design. Check it out. He says, that's crazy. I'm going to fix that. By the next season, all the previous years were back in the media guys. So that's, if you can say anything you want about Peyton, that's one thing you say about him that you have to appreciate.
Yeah, that was ridiculous.
I had to keep an old media guy just to keep up with what went before 1985. You're watching Inside New Orleans Sports each and every Thursday night right here on WLAE-TV. That's at 6 o'clock. There's a rebroadcast every Friday at 10 o'clock on WLAE-TV and on Pelican Sports Television, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Lafayette, 9 p.m. every Friday night. We're looking back on 50 years of the New Orleans Saints. Kenny Trahan of SportsNoel.com, also the Saints Hall of Fame Museum, and so much more, along with Ro Brown of WBOK Radio. And I'm your host, Eric Ash. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Inside New Orleans Sports. We're taking a look back at 50 years of New Orleans Saints history. Kenny Trahan and Ro Brown are our guests tonight. Ro, Hank Stram becomes the Saints coach, and a lot of people like myself during that time thought we were going to turn it around. Ooh. He puts a prolific offense together. Was it Wes Chandler, a number 1 draft choice out of Florida, Henry Childs, Ike Harris comes over, and then you had Thunder and Lightning, Muncie and Galbraith. Talk about your memories of Stram and your memories of that prolific offense.
And Archie Manning,
and Archie Manning,
trigger,
yes.
Of course. NFC Offensive Player of the Year, I think, Archie Manning was, because of what he had around him. Muncie and Galbraith, Thunder and Lightning, terrific backfield. For the first time, I felt like, if you were a Saint fan, you had real professional, top flight football players on offense. Wes Chandler, one of the best athletes and one of the best, receivers and return guys you'd ever want. Ike Harris, very professional, very low key, ran his routes, made the tough catches, the whole works. Offensive line wasn't bad because they had, what was the crazy guy's name?
Conrad Dobler.
Yeah, what was his name? Yeah. Who I ran into, as a matter of fact, at Super Bowl 44. It was as crazy as ever. Yes. But, yeah, J.T. Taylor, Z-Man, Emmanuel Sanders. Yeah, Z-Man was a good football player, out of Jackson State. That offense was just so much fun. Not very good on defense. Right. But, boy, that offense was fun. Yeah. I mean, they scored on anybody and everybody.
Yes, they did. Guys, let's kind of move into the 80s. It starts, obviously, with the 1-15 season, which, as you mentioned, was kind of the downturn for Meekum. But it brought in Bum Phillips, and then that 81 draft, if you remember that 81 draft, which is one of the best drafts in the history of the franchise.
82
was it 82?
82 and 87 drafts were incredible. But just on the backtrack very briefly on that 70s bunch, and even carrying over to the 80s initially, while the defense wasn't very good, there were good players. And the Saints had 2 safeties that might have been the hardest-hitting safety tandem in the NFL. Tommy Myers and Ray Brown. They just punished people like you wouldn't believe. And Myers, to this day, might be my favorite player they've ever had because the guy weighed 190 pounds, and yet he blew people up. He gave his body to science. In fact, I communicated with him today. He left body parts all over the field, on every field in the league. He was something to watch. And Ray Brown came here from Atlanta, and he waylaid people. Those guys, they struck the fear of God into you. You didn't run routes inside the hash marks against the Saints. Those guys kill people. I mean, they kill people. And I'm not trying to overstate it, but they were such vicious hitters. Joe Fetterspiel was a vicious hitter. He hit people like a ton of bricks. Derlin Moore was a good football player, but he's an unbelievable effort guy, that gave you everything he had all the time. So there were some good players.
Don Reese had his problems.
Don Reese was extremely talented.
Don Reese,
he could have had an incredible career,
well.
But unfortunately, Reese arrived here at a bad time because the drug culture really started to infiltrate the franchise, and it was the undoing of this franchise, frankly. Chuck Muncie was Exhibit A, and it's really unfortunate because Chuck Muncie was really a nice guy. Unfortunately, he had some major issues. But so you get into the 80s, and 1 in 15 happened because of what I mentioned previously, because of the drug culture, because of the intervention of John Meekum, bringing in Rosenblum and Guyver. For what reason? Who knows? You just had your best year. You're exciting as can be, and you're going to mess with everything. So Galbraith holds out. Muncie's got a serious problem. He's late for practice, missed a flight, everything imaginable. Reese is a real problem with the guys in the locker room. And a lot of people at the time tried to paint it out as racial. The white guys and the black guys had nothing to do with that, and Archie would tell you that. It had everything to do with the fact that you had a drug culture that had really controlled a certain element of the team, and guys were getting away with it. And they didn't act when they should have acted initially and cut it off. They let it proliferate itself, and then finally Muncie missed a flight for a game, and they decided to trade him. But having said that, they were already done for that year. And then they bring in Bum, and let's draft George Rogers, and we're going to run the ball. And it was actually a pretty smart move on their part, and they became a different team and a physical team. And then the draft you spoke about in '82, when they brought in some great football players. George was obviously great. Ricky was a great player.
Yes, Ricky.
That was '81. You're right.
81.
It was Ricky and George, and they were obviously going to stop right there, but they weren't the only guys that they got in that draft. They ended up doing a really good job of identifying players. Jimmy Wilkes was the 12th round pick. Hokie was the 10th round guy. They had guys that they brought in here that just were really good core of guys. They became a very physical team, but ultimately Bum's quarterback decisions and skill position decisions did him in. He thought Wes Chandler wasn't fast enough.
Yes.
That's what he told us. So he trades him and he drafts Lindsey Scott like he's fast enough. And of course, then he takes the situation at quarterback and ditches Archie, who's the most popular player in franchise history, to bring in a guy who can't even walk anymore, and Kenny Stabler, God bless him.
Yes.
He was still accurate from 5 to 10 yards, but he couldn't move and he couldn't throw the ball 20 yards.
Right.
And he decided he could play people like Jeff Groth. God bless Jeff Groth. He's Guido Merkins became a wide receiver for this team. So you're not going to win that way. You got to have some weapons on offense, and they just never got there. And then I mentioned '83 Black Sunday. As good as they were defensively, they couldn't get over the hump because of the decisions that they made, and obviously because of the lack of offense that they had.
By 1985, Bum was burned out. Wade Phillips takes over for a short stint in the middle of the season, and then along comes a guy named Jim Finks.
Yeah, still to this day, I think of all the people I've met in pro football, he was a guy who knew everybody's job. He knew your job. He knew everything. He is the first person I met who knew everything and knew how to handle everything. Sometimes he handled it not the way you would have, and sometimes he was bullheaded. But, Jim Finks, he was brilliant. Just to talk to him, I mean, it was just brilliant. I've seen him walk into the times where he'd make some decision and the fan base would be mad at him, and he'd show up at the touchdown club or whatever, and everybody would just be mad at him.
Never missed a quarterback club.
And he'd walk out an hour later and had everybody eating out of his hand. And I'd tell him, you did it again, didn't you? And he'd just look at me with that cigarette and smile. Again, he was very, very important hire because there comes Jim Mora.
Jim Mora after that. But it was Tom Benson that made that move when he bought this franchise and saved this franchise from going to Jacksonville. I can remember it clear as day as Meekum getting off the plane at the old Gator, off the helicopter, the old Gator Stadium. And, there was a lot of talk that the Saints were moving on. They were going to be moving to Jacksonville.
With Bum.
Right, with Bum, no doubt. And then Governor Edwards gets involved, and I know there was the Pritzkers out of Chicago was supposed to buy it. Lo and behold, some unknown car dealer out of New Orleans comes in with Texas ties and buys this team and does a smart move. Tom Benson turns to Jim Finks, who at that time had just left the Chicago Cubs, right?
Correct.
And
Worked
makes
for Hill
him
Knowlton,
part
one of the
owner
PR people.
and president and general manager.
Yeah, well, Jim Finks was universally respected and should have been the commissioner of the league.
Yep.
Ultimately, but
Thought he was going to.
that was a brilliant move on the part of Tom Benson. Give Tom Benson all the credit in the world. He really did save the franchise initially, and there's no question that he's a pivotal figure in the history of the franchise and a very rich man because of it. Bought it for $69 million, and Lord knows what you can get for it now. That said, he made a very, very intelligent move to bring in Jim Finks, and Finks made a very intelligent move to hire Jim Mora, who basically dominated the United States Football League. And the reason it was such a good hire was not only was Mora a good coach and a disciplinarian with his Marine background, and the thing you could always say about his teams more than anything else is they beat the teams that they were supposed to beat.
Right.
They lost to the teams that were better than them on a consistent basis, but they unfortunately came along at the wrong time. Because the Saints, to this day, if they were in the AFC, I guarantee you, they not only would have won playoff games, they could have gotten to a Super Bowl. But unfortunately, during that era, you had the dynastic franchises, including in their own division, the 49ers. And then you had the Joe Gibbs Redskins, and you had the Bill Parcells Giants. And on the back end, you had the Jimmy Johnson Cowboys. So all in the NFC, and the Saints were part of that. So it's bad fortune. But Mora was an underrated, really good football coach who deserves an enormous amount of credit. I think Finks and Mora and, frankly, the other three members of the Dome Patrol should be the guys that should be on that Ring of Honor in the Dome, not just in the Saints Hall of Fame because of what they accomplished. So, yep, they brought stability. They brought winning, obviously, and they brought excitement. That 87 season, to me, is still the most special season ever because you never won before. Mora could have been elected mayor, governor, anything he wanted. And the fire, and my wife was at the Sensations. That was their first year. My wife danced for the team, and so I was all over the place with them. And the excitement, it was incredible. Yeah. I mean, that's all people could talk about 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. It was special. I mean, it was like a light lit up in the city. And, you know, it hasn't been extinguished since, quite frankly.
For a 5-year period, the Saints were the winningest team in the NFC.
And they couldn't get over the hump because of who they were in the
And the reason they were the second winningest team, and the problem was the winningest team was in their division.
Yes. San Francisco 49ers.
Yeah.
Right. They were an incredible franchise.
Yeah.
But, and you go back and look at, and people want to ridicule Mora for not winning a playoff game. And look, everybody's entitled to their opinion. That's fine. But go back and look at the games. There was only one of those they blew, the Eagles game. If you go back and look at the playoff appearances, the first year was the not ready for primetime players against the Vikings. Okay, they just got shellacked because the team was better than they were. Yes. The second time they got in, they're playing with Steve Walsh and John Fourcade at quarterback because of Jim Finks' stubbornness with Bobby Hebert. Yes. And they really hurt that team at a time when they were in their prime. And so they don't win in Chicago. You know, then the Falcons game, the next year, the Saints, as you might recall, go 7-0, and Hebert gets hurt. Right. And they stumbled toward the finish line. They won out in Arizona, covered the game to win the division and go to the playoffs. But they play the Falcons, and they're playing the Falcons with 3 of their 4 secondary starters out for the game.
Michael Haynes
goes nuts, and they missed a tackle. See you later. But the point was that those 3 games, because of the circumstances, they weren't going to win those games, unfortunately. Right. The Eagles game was a different story. Had total control of the game, dominating the game. Then they have a play where Cunningham just throws one he never should throw deep down the center of the field. In the double coverage, 2 guys are there. Neither one can make a play. Touchdown. The game turns on that. And that was the end of the Saints and that era. It really was. Yes. Jim Mora stayed through the middle of 96, but it was over with that day because that's when they decided, you know, we're breaking this up.
Yes.
Brock was gone after the year. Hebert was gone after the year. Within a matter of 2 years, Eric Martin's gone. Vaughn Johnson's gone. Sam Mills is gone. Then Ricky. Morton, of course, in 84. I mean, these were iconic players. Yes. I mean, great football players on a great defensive football team that never had the offensive weaponry to be what they needed to be. They were a workmanlike offense. Eric Martin's their best player, and he couldn't run either. He was like a modern-day Danny Abramowitz, just a guy that caught everything, was tough as nails, and would take every hit imaginable. Great player. Dalton Hilliard was a really good football player and then got hurt. Reuben Mays was electric fast, and then he got hurt. So they just didn't have the weaponry, and then they didn't draft well. You know, once the 89-90 seasons rolled around, they drafted poorly for a few years.
Wrote the USFL and what is it, the 86 draft were really as Kenny was.
It was like 2 drafts.
Right.
That's why
it was like 2
the
drafts.
hire of Mora was such a good hire.
Right.
It was like
because
2 drafts.
not only did he dominate the USFL, he had all the ties that bonded to that league. And that's how he was the one that went into Jim Finks and said, This guy, Mel Gray.
Sam Mills.
We got to have
Vaughn
Sam Mills. I don't care what he looks like.
Mel
Antonio
Gray,
Gibson. We got to have this guy.
Gibson.
Take a look at him. You know, even Willie Collier. I mean, you can go back and look at that initial team.
Exactly.
They had like 7 guys that were good football players.
Bobby
all
Hebert.
from the USFL.
That's right.
And Jim Mora was the guy that said, Jim thinks, Jim, here's the guys we need to get right here. And that's the reason when you added them into the guys that Bum had here previously that they became the team they became.
And that, what is it, that 86 draft with Mays and Dalton?
Yeah.
Dombrowski.
Dombrowski.
Jim.
Those were
Dombrowski.
good
On and
stones.
on, yeah.
Right, no doubt. As we leave the 90s and go into the 2000s, obviously Jim Haslett is the coach of this team. Not a real big splash with Haslett for the most part. Your
But
thoughts?
first playoff win.
Exactly.
Got to give him that. First playoff win.
Right.
You know, that's all you need to say about the Jim Haslett era to me, I think. You know, first playoff win.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's something to be said there, too. Everybody forgets the role that Randy Mueller played here. Randy Mueller
Yes.
really did an outstanding job of assembling people. And it's not for me to say what happened with him and ownership, but unfortunately, that was cut short. Mickey Loomis was his right-hand man, and he ended up taking over. But Jim Haslett came in at the right time. They made some really smart acquisitions. Joe Horn was a part-time receiver basically in Kansas City. And then you looked at Norman Hand. Everybody, he's too heavy. He's not going to be able to play. They brought in a similar guy, Grady Jackson. Then they had Mitchell, who was fast as heck as linebacker. Mark Fields, who could really run at linebacker. And then you look at the other pieces that they were able to fit in. And then they brought in a quarterback, and Jeff Blake, who was a deep ball guy and played honest. He played honestly decent to solid football here, got hurt. And then Aaron Brooks comes in, and he does things that they haven't seen before, running around like crazy, throwing the ball like 70 yards on a line. Like, wow. So when you saw that happen, you're like, man, we got something here that's going to be fantastic. But then they ended up making a series of moves over several years that proved to be fatal. Sammy Knight was too slow. He wasn't good enough, right? So you signed to Bucky Jones for a boatload of money. Leroy Glover's too small.
Right.
Yeah, he's too small.
17 sacks from inside.
Unbelievable. I mean,
They're still looking for that guy.
Albert Connell, okay? Where do you want me to stop? They made a series of moves that undermined the potential success of this team that kept them a 500-type team for the rest of the regime until Katrina hit, which obviously you can't blame Jim Haslett.
No, you
Exhibition game where they had the natural turf indoors. Saints played the Packers.
Packers, yeah.
I can
I have
remember
the
after the
turf
game,
in the museum.
after everybody was gone, sitting in there talking to Brett while he was eating his Subway sandwich. Everybody else was gone. He said, you know, y'all got a guy here, you know, the backup that we had, Aaron Brooks. He could do something.
Right.
I didn't think anything
until the injury,
I really
though, right,
didn't.
Roy?
I didn't
Right,
think anything of it. You know, I really didn't. I said, oh, yeah, he'll
Well,
probably be
I mean,
all right.
and he's asking about the injury. I mean, Aaron had a mercurial start, and then the second year he's 9-4, and he's playing really high-level football. He got hurt,
Right.
And they elected to stay with him. And this is to this day the two reasons that Saints fans don't like Aaron
there's
Brooks.
no
Not all Saints fans, but some
yeah.
don't like Aaron Brooks is because one, they didn't play Jake Delhomme when he was hurt, and Delhomme goes on to be a really good NFL quarterback. Did they know that at the time? No.
Nope.
Two, because of Aaron's mannerisms. And when we brought Aaron back, when he was inducted into the Saints Hall of Fame, which I caught a lot of grief for from people, it's a media selection committee decision, which you're part of, and it's a private vote.
I voted for him.
And it's a private vote.
But I voted for him.
But having
and I
said
vote
that,
for him again.
the point I'm making is it was not a unanimous decision.
No.
And the only time we reveal anything is if it's unanimous, because this is a private vote amongst skilled professionals who have a clue. And there was a spirited debate. And he gets in, and we heard grief, and even somebody I respect a lot wrote something absolutely ridiculously stupid, which I called him out on. And that said, you know, and comparing him to, you know, who's next, Billy Joe Tolliver and things like that, just absolutely, you know, just pointless and mindless and unprofessional. Look, the guy's mannerisms, and when Aaron was inducted, the point I was going to make is, I think you might have been there, when the speech he gave was phenomenal.
Yeah.
This is a man pouring out his heart and saying, look, I was 22 years old. I was young. I didn't know how to handle this. It really, and it hurt me a lot when people said bad things about me. He said, I was young. I didn't know how to handle it. Right. So I can handle it a lot better now. To this day, I think it's why he washed out in the league as early as he did. Because the guy's physical ability, I mean, he's 6'5".
Yeah.
He could run a 4.6, 4.7. He could throw the ball through a tire from 40 yards away. I mean, the guy had every skill imaginable. Was he a great quarterback? No. Was he good? Yes. Was he very good? No. He was a good player.
Right.
he did something here that hadn't been done before. He won the first playoff game in the history of the franchise, and he did it virtually single-handedly. Does anyone remember
and have the numbers
his wide receiving core in that game against the Rams, the defending world champions, the best team in the league? Does anybody remember who his running back was in that game? Oh, everybody was hurt.
Right.
Yeah. You know, Joe Horn was out. Ricky Williams was out. He's playing with guys that were B-leaguers guys, or D-leaguers if you call the NBA. So, look, he was the primary reason. You give him a lot of credit. And I don't overstate the case at all, but again, he was probably as misunderstood a figure as you've had here.
Road, Katrina happens, and then, of course, there's a possibility that the Saints may be moving to Texas. Arnie Filko comes out. He blows the lid off the possible move to Texas. They end up moving back to New Orleans, and, of course, the Dome coming. But before that, they found a guy named Sean Payton, and along with him came a guy named Drew Brees.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, those two names, it says it all, quite frankly. I wasn't in town when they signed Drew Brees, and I thought, okay, that's a good signing. Okay. But I never dreamed that it would turn out this way. You know, he's, surefire first ballot Hall of Famer. You know, wasn't when he arrived here, but he certainly is now. And look where this franchise is now. We're at a point now where, even though we still treat it, we have that fanaticism of the college crowd, but, we expect to win now.
Yes.
Okay. Saints fans expect to win. They want to win. When you're not winning, they want to know what's wrong. And it wasn't always that way. That's a change of mindset for Saints fans. And, Sean Payton and Drew Brees and crew are the reason why that's happened. And I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing.
2006, they go to the NFC Championship, and that took that. Look, if the city ever needed something, they needed that more than anything at that point.
Right.
A lot of us digging out of
timing.
It was incredible. Digging out of after Katrina, people trying to figure out if they're coming back to New Orleans. Didn't matter where you were glued to the Saints, and they represented us.
I have always felt, Eric and Kenny, I've never felt that pro football teams lend to the economy what they say it does.
Yes.
I never thought that. Okay. But this was a case where, you literally felt that a pro football team really had something to do with the return of the city.
No doubt.
From Katrina. I mean, I did. I really did. I felt that way.
I did too.
I don't buy the economics of it, but I really do feel that way. I
Kenny,
really do.
Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, credit to Arnie Filko and credit to Paul Tagliabue because the Saints wouldn't be here if it weren't for those gentlemen, with all due respect, because Tom Benson's done a lot of really good things since he's done everything really well. In fact, in my estimation, he's done things wonderfully for the past few years. The benevolence is beautiful to see.
Agreed.
His wife has clearly steered him in a good direction in that regard. You can't take it with you when you leave this earth. And whatever I have, I want my children to have. I want to do as many good things as I possibly can, and he's done that. But with what happened to this day, look, I'm a man of faith. I think things happen for a reason. And when the Dolphins make the decision on Drew Brees, they had sound rationale and reasoning to do what they did. The Saints took a chance, but then again, what else did they have? Right. So they took the chance, and I don't think in their wildest dreams they could have imagined that it would turn out this well. Because the guy has been a remarkable player, a remarkable citizen. He's done everything the right way. He's the most significant player in the franchise's history. I can say that now.
No.
Previously, I would have said Ricky Jackson. And Willie Roaf and Morton Anderson would have been right there, but Ricky would be the most significant guy. But Brees, because of the position he plays, what he's done, the ultimate winning a Super Bowl and playing phenomenal in that game, he's the guy. So credit to what they've been able to do. Now the question is, can they reinvent themselves? Because they must reinvent themselves. Otherwise, this is going to be a distant memory.
Yes. We'll talk about that Super Bowl win. Talk about that year, that 2009 year that was magical here in New Orleans.
I never thought I'd see it.
Right?
I really didn't.
Me neither.
I didn't. I didn't think I'd see it. And I'm glad I was around to see it. It's really kind of hard to describe. We all sat around and said, man, can you imagine how it would be if the Saints ever won a Super Bowl? Well, lo and behold, it happens. And, for me, it turned out to be everything that we thought it would be. Just looking and just feeling and, talking to people about it and people talking to you about it.
The vibe was incredible.
It was incredible. Yeah, it turned out to be everything I thought it would be. You know, how the feeling would be around here if the Saints ever won the Super Bowl. It was incredible.
Right.
It was incredible.
Kenny, what can you add?
Well, again, being born and raised, and my dad being an original season ticket holder, and he was dying of cancer at the time, and he lived long enough to see them win the Super Bowl. He perished in August of that year, in 2010. That, to me, was what it was all about. We still own the tickets to this day. We kept him, and he was such a gigantic fan. And so I immediately harkened back to that. I thought about my sister and being out in the heat of Tulane Stadium for all those years, sweating profusely, my wife dancing for all those years, myself doing the broadcasts, which I did. And it just all came flashing before me and said, "This is it's hard to believe that this has happened." I didn't know what to think when the interception occurs and Tracy Porter's going the other way. I just kind of I wasn't screaming.
Is this real?
I was just like,
Yeah.
Just blank expression. And I turned to my son, and my son's like, he's getting excited. And I said, he said, "Dad, you win the Super Bowl." I said, "Yeah, I know." I'm like, I didn't know what to think or say. It took a while to set in. It's like, it's the Saints.
Yeah.
And to see that happen, look, I don't care if you're in the media. I don't care if you run the Saints Hall of Fame. I don't care if you're a season ticket holder. You're a human being, and you're a fan. And I recall, look, when they won that game in 2006 against the Eagles in the Dome, you were sitting right by me. And I was emotional, and I know you were too. Because, this is our team. It doesn't matter what industry you're working in. We're human beings. For people to say, well, you can't be a fan. Of course I'm a fan. I want them to win badly.
Yeah. Everybody does.
I just have to do a job.
Right. Yeah.
So you separate the two, and you give an honest analysis and try not to make it personal.
Right. Guys, so many times we've left out, so many characters left out, like Buddy Diliberto, but we're out of time. And
Mike Ditka.
We managed to skip over that.
We did. Just so many that we just didn't get to, but it's been a great ride these last 50 years, hasn't it?
Yeah. It's such an integral part of the city now. It's you can't have New Orleans without the Saints.
No doubt about it.
Well, we've been here for all 50. The question is, will we all be here for the 60th? I hope so.
Let's all hope so, that's for sure. Kenny Trahan, Ro Brown, thanks so much for being on the panel tonight.
Thank you.
For a look back at the 50 years of the New Orleans Saints.
It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's been a pleasure having you two guys. Thanks so much for tuning in. Remember, there's a rebroadcast of this program each and every Friday night right here on WLE at 10 p.m., also on Pelican Sports Television at 9 o'clock in the New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Lafayette markets. You can catch me on the radio, 990 a.m. WGSO, 11 a.m. until 1 p.m. weekdays. You can catch that on the TuneIn Radio app, which is a free download for your smartphone or tablet. Also, you can listen live, download the podcast at ericasher.com as well. Remember, all the previous episodes of Inside New Orleans Sports is also at ericasher.com. I want to thank our guests, Ro Brown and Kenny Trahan, also the WLE production staff, including Ron Yeager, Jim Dotson, Kenny Juno, Donovan Jodos, and also my director, William Hill. New Orleans, thanks so much for watching. We'll catch you right back here next week for another edition of Inside New Orleans Sports.